What's interesting how timeless this discussion we're having is. I mean, Marcus would have recognized it himself, right? Um, in Meditations, Marcus Aurelius talks quite a bit about the other emperors who come before him, right? This is an elite club he's in. Some are more famous than others. But, he talks a lot about Alexander the Great, right? Who was sort of the historical model for manliness and greatness and success and ambition. He's the greatest conqueror that ever lived, one of the great military
How
minds.
far before Aurelius was he?
Alexander the Great dies not long before Zeno makes his way to Athens. So it's a long time, and we're talking 500 years or
Whoa.
so. It's interesting how we tend to think like the
Mm.
ancient world is so compressed. Marcus Aurelius quotes poets in Meditations that were further away from his time than Shakespeare is from ours.
Whoa.
So this goes back. This is a long tradition, and the debates about greatness and ambition and power. It's there. The Xerxes, the Persian king who wanted to conquer the world, Alexander the Great, who does conquer the world. Alexander the Great, he is this great, brilliant conqueror. And, he makes it to the end of the earth, and his men finally rebel. And they go, we want to go home. We've been doing this for, 20 years. And he says,
Jesus.
what are you going to, he's like, are you going to go home and let it be said that you left Alexander the Great alone to finish conquering? And they were like, yeah. And there's some argument that his men killed him. But Marcus Aurelius tries to talk to himself in meditation. He goes, you can't compare yourself against this guy. He's like, it's important that you remember that Alexander the Great and his mule driver both died, and they were both buried in the same earth, right? That death is this great equalizer, that you don't get to take these accomplishments with you. And so to be insatiable in life is really a kind of an emptiness, kind of a torture that doesn't pay off the way that you think it does, right? And so in the ancient world, they were constantly looking at these figures. And there's this famous exchange. I mentioned Diogenes earlier. Diogenes is this great philosopher, sort of a predecessor of the Stoics, and he meets Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great's a big fan. He's a student of philosophy himself, and he comes across Alexander comes across Diogenes, who's like laying by the side of the road, just sunning himself. And Alexander the Great sort of walks over him, and he says, hi, I am Alexander the Great. What can I do for you? Thinking that, he can bestow favors on this man and impress him. And Diogenes looks at him and he says, you can stop blocking my sun. And the idea, the contrast, the reason the ancients would tell this story was to say that actually Diogenes is greater than Alexander the Great, because Diogenes is self-sufficient. Diogenes has reduced his needs to zero. Diogenes doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. And he had sort of taken a different path in life. And I think there's probably a middle ground between these two that we want to embody. But Stephen Pressfield, right?
Yeah.
Stephen Pressfield writes a great novel about Alexander the Great called The Virtues of War, I think. And there's a fictional scene between Alexander and Diogenes, and he sort of renders another one of their meetings. And I think it illustrates this tension. Alexander the Great goes to Diogenes and says, I have conquered the world. What have you ever done? And Diogenes says, I have conquered the need to conquer the world, right? And so I think it's great to be driven to try to do things, but the Stoics would say, are those things driving you, or are you driving them, right? What are you a slave to, right? Who's actually in control of your life? And so I think oftentimes the people that we hold up as heroes or that we admire, if you actually get up close with them and you see that they're not as free as you think they are, they're not as powerful as you think they are, they're a slave to something or someone, even if it's just like their overscheduled calendar. And so, what's beautiful about meditations is you have this immensely powerful man trying to get to the root of what it actually means to be powerful. And I think he settles on the idea of being in command of yourself is actually a rarer thing than being in command of an army or an empire or a great legacy or whatever one is after in life.
Mm. Okay, so this idea of being a slave to the things that you're into, that's one of the things that I worry about a lot with the modern world. So
Yeah.
you have porn beginning to skew
Sure.
people, the idea that you could see more attractive naked women in a single session than most men would have seen in their entire lives
Sure.
is pretty crazy. OnlyFans, which is a whole thing. I don't even know how to conceptualize it. That's when I had my head down and I was just working for, whatever,
Yeah.
2 decades. I look up and OnlyFans is the thing that I haven't fully grappled with what that means. Drugs, just food. Like there are so many things.
I mean, you can get on a plane for $200 and travel basically anywhere you want, right? At any time. Like it's wonderful how accessible and real like technology and capitalism has made things, but it also makes it hard to be self-contained, to be self-sufficient, to be in control of your life and not controlled by the endless urges and temptations and distractions and pleasures that are out there.
Are the
And
pleasures bad?
well, the Stoics would say that pleasure isn't bad per se, but they would ask, how do you feel the morning after, right? They would ask, uh, what regrets come from it, right? What negative consequences come from it. Musonius Rufus is one of the great Stoics. He's the teacher of Epictetus. He says, when you work hard on something, it's painful, but the pain passes quickly and the virtue or the accomplishment remains. But he says, when you do something for pleasure, the pleasure passes quickly, but the shame remains. And so when I think about the things that people do, whether it's drugs or drinking or sexual stuff or just any of the pleasures that we chase, it's fun in the moment, it's rewarding in the moment, but the costs come later, and you can't separate those costs. You can't go, I had an awesome time drinking last night without integrating the morning hangover into that cost benefit analysis. But that's kind of the problem that we do, right? It's like you're eating whatever you want, you're not exercising because it's hard. Well, you don't see the consequences of that until you look in the mirror 6 months from now, right? And vice versa, when you decide to work out and to eat clean and to push yourself and to be disciplined, you don't see the benefits of that until later. And our inability to deal with that, I think, is a big part of why we're not the people we want to be or the people that we can be.
I have a thesis.
Yeah,
Many people need to be chased by a lion, obviously as a
sure.
metaphor, in order to have their life focused, take on meaning, because then you have a thing to deal with. You
Yeah.
have a thing that provides that structure.
Yeah.
And so when I look at the modern landscape, the thing that I really worry about is that there is no, like, you can, in a modern context, you can live in your parents' basement until you're 35, and
Sure.
there's really no major consequence for that.
Right.
And what do you think about that? So, like, what do you make of something like OnlyFans, where when, I've been married for 21 years, I will often give relationship advice or have relationship guests on the show. And one of the comments you will see in the thread is one person will be like, oh, I think you should listen to Tom's advice. He's been married for 21 years.
Yeah.
Then somebody else would be like, yeah, he got married 21 years ago. There was no social media.
Sure.
There was no swiping right. Like one you'll see a lot is women would settle back then. So I was like, thanks, guys.
Yeah, sure.
And like, what do you think about that? What is the thing that has broken, that has left men spending inordinate amounts of money
Yeah.
on a woman they're never going to meet,
Right.
who almost certainly is, you're not actually talking to them.
Yeah.
You're talking to like probably a guy
Yeah.
that's running their account.
Yeah.
All while, and here's where my brain broke, all while you could go get free porn.
Yeah.
So this isn't just about masturbating. Like there's free stuff that you could do you don't have to pay for. What the fuck? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think one thing broke. I think a lot of things broke, right? And so,
What are those things?
well, I mean, first off, yeah, the an unlimited amount of high definition pornography is an incredible temptation to any lonely person,
I
right?
get porn far more than I get OnlyFans.
I mean, at a certain point, watching pornography is lonely and unrewarding because human beings desire and need connection and relationships. But if you have been left behind. Like we talk about people who've been left behind like workers, right? You're a factory worker and now that job can be done cheaper in China or it requires way more education than you have. You're left behind. But I think a lot of people are left behind when all of a sudden the dating market is so much more efficient, right? Where the competition is so much more severe, right? Where people don't have to settle, like you're saying, because they have access to unlimited fish in the sea. And so this means if you don't have your life together, if you're, not taking care of yourself, if you don't have the emotional wherewithal and skills, like it's always been hard to be a person and to find your people, right? By that I mean friends and I mean potential spouse or life partner. It's always been hard. But then, what we ask of people today is so much greater. We demand emotional awareness. Like I have young kids. The emotional awareness and the load that I'm supposed to carry and the level of involvement I'm supposed to have in their lives is enormously bigger than my father had and incomprehensibly bigger 1 to 2 generations back, right? And then you think about the technological prowess that a person has to have. You think about how expensive things like it's just hard to be a person. And so people are left behind. And so if suddenly you can fool yourself into thinking that this beautiful adult actress or sex worker is into you, that illusion is going to be more comfortable than facing the hard reality. Have you ever watched the MTV show Catfish?
No.
You know what catfishing
Yeah,
is,
yeah, I'm very
right?
familiar with the
It's
concept.
it's it's actually a really revealing show
Are they
about
intentionally catfishing people?
no, no, the show is people who think they're being catfished and then they come and help them investigate to see whether they are or not. And I think it's actually a really revealing look into what it's like to be one of these kinds of people in the world because
These kind of incels? What are we talking about?
incel is a strong word, but somebody who is struggling, like struggling to find real people in real life,
Mm.
right? And invariably, the person has fallen for someone that is not just out of their league, but obviously out of their league to everyone but them, right? It's like, and so cognitive dissonance is a powerful force. And so when this male or female model randomly slides into your DMs on social media and falls for you, an unemployed person working in your parents, living in your parents' basement, and they're really successful, but they don't have a phone that works, so that's why you can't FaceTime. Like they're not seeing what's obviously there because to see what is there would mean despair, right?
Mm.
To see that they have been wasting their life or that the world is unfair or unjust or, much, more difficult than they would like it to be. That's a hard truth to face. And I think it's easier to turn to illusions like falling in love with some, random person who's tricking you and ultimately going to take money from you and a lot of what's happening on adult websites or OnlyFans is just a slightly more ruthless version of that same thing. They're creating a parasocial relationship with someone where you feel like it's a two-way street and it's fundamentally a one-way street, and you would rather live in those delusions than go to the gym, go back to school, go to therapy, deal with the unfair or awful hand that life dealt you. But even if it is unfair, even if is unjust, it doesn't change the fact that that's what you were dealt. And you got to figure out what you're going to do with that.
If you like that clip, check out another powerful clip right here, and I'll see you there.